Welcome back to another episode of Trip Report. On today's solo episode, I'm going to be discussing my second weekend up in the mountains sitting with ayahuasca. Up until this point, it kind of seems like I've been beating a dead horse with my encounters and the lessons that I've learned. Every experience up to this point was military, divorce, being a bad husband, more recently, the childhood stuff, the lack of self-esteem. And I just didn't want everybody to think like, oh, it's same stuff again and again and again. It doesn't matter what substance you use. It's the same things that come up. And what are you learning from this? And it was actually after this weekend that I was able to lay one of those to rest. So it was just over a month after the first ayahuasca experience. I had actually received an email from the facilitator and she said, hey, we have one spot left. Is there any chance you want to take it? And I don't think I was really in a rush to get back into that space, but I'm a believer that when things come my way, to just embrace it and don't allow it. Don't think that it's just a coincidence. Like it came up for a reason. And in my mind, I was like, she reached out to me and there was a reason she reached out to me and I need to take advantage of this. I had the funds available. I had the time available and I figured, let's just go for it. So like I said, just a little bit over a month later, this one was 7/24 of 2020. And I began with, I have a journal entry that says, so here we go again, a little over a month from my first experience. I originally thought I wouldn't be running back here anytime soon, but I feel like I unpacked and implemented my recent downloads and was interested to see what else my subconscious or Mother Ayahuasca needed to show me. I also journaled that since the last experience, I have felt substantially better and more grounded, and even falling off the wagon a bit and gaining some weight, I still felt more comfortable as myself. My intentions for the second weekend was to, again, look for the root cause of my autoimmune stuff, to get more comfortable in my own skin, and then to look for any remaining childhood trauma that might be there. So this is again up in the mountains, different Airbnb this time. And a couple of the people were the same that were there the first week. All the facilitators were the same. A couple of the attendees were the same, but it was a lot of new faces. So just like the last time, the first night we sat down, gave all the ground rules to the newcomers, and then, well, we'll just dive into it. So the ceremony began just before dusk. It was a slightly larger dose than my previous time. The first cup was certainly more potent this time around, but I still compared it to that of like a 3-gram mushroom trip. The first stirred up some more childhood trauma, specifically a bully that I had as a kid named Eric. The kid was relentless. He would sit behind me in class and flick me in the back of the ear. If he would sit next to me, he would swing his hand at me, acting like he was going to hit me. And if I would flinch, he'd go up 2 for flinching, and then, hit me in the arm and be like, oh, you flinched again. Here's 2 more. And any class that I had with the kid was just pure hell. I think in my mind, I had set it aside as like, oh, I was a dork and I deserved the bullying that I was getting. But the message that came through as I, re-encountered all of these bullying situations was that I wasn't a dork and I wasn't at all deserving of that torment that I was receiving. I was able to kind of step back and see the core of where that abuse spawned from. And it was from that kid, Eric, being the product of a broken home. He was around since I was in elementary school, but when I was in elementary school, he was in my older brother's class. He was a year ahead. And I was aware of his background. He was under the care of his grandmother, so obviously his parents weren't a part of the picture. And he eventually was held back because he wasn't the sharpest tool in the shed. So and he was always the troublemaker, the bully that I ended up dealing with. Like when we were in elementary school and he was still a year senior in my brother's class, there was a kid, they were playing with modeling clay or something. The kid built a bridge and the bridge was held up with some pencils and then the clay. And he came up trying to be a tough guy and slammed his hand down on the bridge to smash it in front of the kid and put a pencil straight through his hand. So, I mean, there was some great karma right there for him, but he never learned his lesson, clearly. But what I realized going through all these experiences again was that him seeing me in class was a constant reminder that he was a failure. And, the fact that he had been held back and that he was seeing me, the younger brother of the kid whose class he should have been in if he wasn't such a screw up. And he took all that pain out on me. Fortunately, early on in middle school, I was bumped up into the scholar classes and I left him behind in the dust, but the damage had already been done. It was interesting because after the experience with the ayahuasca, I actually felt empathy for him rather than like the anger and fear that I held as an adolescent. So I wrote in the journal that I felt pretty much sober by the time that I unpacked all of this bullying experience that came through on that first cup. So coming back down, feeling sober, when the second cup was offered, I jumped right on it to get back in and go deeper. And the second cup took a much darker turn. My mind just started wandering through thoughts of death, specifically about parents. And by the time that my parents had reached my age, both of my parents had lost their parents. So I never got to meet the grandparents on my father's side. And I was so young when my mom's parents died that I only had vague memories of them, and unfortunately not so pleasant ones considering what my grandma went through battling cancer. I realized that I didn't know much about my father's parents at all, and that I needed to ask him more about them. It's bizarre to think that it's storytelling that keeps the memory of our ancestors alive. Nowadays, we have high quality video cameras in our pockets to capture every single moment, but many of our great grandparents didn't have any access to video recording. And then our grandparents, if they even had a video camera, captured very low quality, often without audio. My parents had a VHS camcorder. The quality was passable and at least it had audio, but if the tapes aren't digitized, they can easily be lost forever. So in this case, the only way for me to get to know about my dad's parents are through him or his brothers and sisters. It went back into more acoustic music and again, like thinking back to childhood and parents and all that kind of stuff. And it brought up the memories of my dad playing guitar for my brother and I again as kids. And it just made me think that I really hope he's still playing guitar and that he's able to play it to my niece, because I think it could be just as impactful as her as it was for me, that I can reflect back on these memories so many years later. And then I wrote that if he doesn't have a guitar, I should probably get him one so that he can get back to it. So all of the thoughts of death and parents and grandparents and everything, it just really made me annoyed with COVID and the outlandish way that the government had handled the situation. It made me sick to think that while people were lying on their deathbeds in the hospitals, that family members were banned from visiting them because of some fancy flu that they had. And this ceremony was again during the lockdown and the mask craze nonsense. And I was so grateful that the facilitators were smart enough to realize the hoax of it all and continue to provide these healing ceremonies for people that clearly needed it. I had some nausea kicking up around this time, and I feel like I could have held the purge back if I wanted to, but it wouldn't make sense to do so because I had previously come to the conclusion that the purges were tied to trauma. So if it felt like it needed to come out, then it needed to get out. And I hit the bucket, got some out, but it was nowhere near as aggressive as night 2 of that previous ceremony. So long story short, it just made me realize that I need to go out of my way to spend more time with my family, whether it's more trips back to the East Coast or planning meetups elsewhere for annual family vacations. It was just, it showed me that time flies, life is short, and it's important to spend as much time that you can with the people that you love. Finally, that first night ceremony wound down with some thoughts of my ex-wife. It felt like I needed to reach out to her and just bury the hatchet. The strange part was that I felt weird about reaching out to her. I mean, somebody who I was so close to, spent 10 years, a third of my life with, I felt like I'd be reaching out to a stranger. It was a bizarre thought process to encounter, but with that, the ceremony was just brought to an end. The effects of it lingered for probably another 30 minutes or so, but as usual, I headed out to the car, threw on some headphones, and just took in the unbelievable starry skies that the mountains had to offer. This brings us into day 2. Again, I chose to fast the entire weekend, so I woke up, journaled, joined the share circle, and then I took a stroll to check out what the little mountain town had to offer and caught up with some of the other people that were there that weekend. One gentleman had been recently diagnosed with cancer, and he was a heavy smoker. I mean, every time we weren't in ceremony, it seemed like he had a cigarette in his mouth. It was funny because he was talking about all these different teas he was drinking and the medicinal benefits of the teas and all that. And I just asked him, I was like, look, if your whole goal is to cleanse the body and hopefully battle against this cancer, why do you keep introducing the toxins from the cigarettes into your system? And when I asked him that, it seemed like that thought had never even crossed his mind. So he sat back with it for a second, and he said that his intention for that night was to take the cigarette addiction in with him and see what the root cause of that was, or if there was a possible way to kick it. So we fast forward to dusk, and we were at it again. I journaled that I was a little nervous to see how round 2 goes, because during the last weekend, night 2 was so much more difficult than night 1. I also wrote that I was hoping to interact with the mother ayahuasca again, because it seemed like more healing happened when I felt her presence, and I didn't feel that presence or the presence of any entities on night 1. So the cups were dispersed, we drank, and like night 2 on my first ayahuasca weekend, absolutely nothing happened. So I sat there stone sober and confused, just waiting for that second cup to be offered. I went up for the second cup. She asked me how everything was going, told her again, nothing, absolutely stone sober. So she offered me a heavy second cup. So I slammed that and went back to my mat. It seemed like that second cup for sure did the trick, because it was almost as if the vision started immediately when I got back to the mat, and the nausea immediately began to build. So I did start to feel the presence of the mother. And the message that came through was that I needed to let go of any more negative feelings that I held about my ex. It was unnecessary anger, fear, sadness, whatever you want to call it, that I just no longer needed in my life. The purge came, and it was pretty gnarly. I mean, back to that exorcist style vomiting that I had night 2 of the previous one when I encountered all the childhood stuff. The nausea began to subside. I think they swapped the bucket for me. And then I got the message again. It was kind of like, I'm proud of you, but you missed some. And the nausea hit me real hard, real quick. And I was back over the bucket and threw up a little bit more. After that, I laid back on the mat, and just like the last night 2, I was just super comfortable. Felt like I melted into the mat. And the mother ayahuasca was just like very affirming and loving, and just kind of showing me how wonderful life was, just giving me like flashes of all the things that I'm so grateful for to have in life. And it was, all the people around me, the family members, friends, loved ones, my dogs, the house that I have, just everything that I've been blessed with. She was just kind of showing it to me and reaffirming that everything in life is just amazing. And while all of the loved ones cycled through my memory or through my mind or whatever you want to call it, I was just like sending my own personal like healing love and vibrations or energy or whatever you want to say to them. And it kind of, I think this was one of the things that opened up for me what the power of like prayer is from a biblical standpoint, because there's some fascinating research studies that are done around prayer. Like there were some where there was somebody sick and dying, or, some ailment that was on another side of the planet, and they reached out to people all over the earth and said, I don't know if they sent like a photo of the person or what it was, and they said, we want all of you to pray on this person. So somebody they didn't know, that, neither the recipient or the prayer knew, and there was like miraculous remission of symptoms and everything. So I think coming from a religious background, I had always thought prayer was just like the mind-numbing recital of memorized doctrine or whatever it was, Our Fathers, Hail Marys, those kind of things. And what this kind of showed me was that a true prayer is just setting your intention of healing or love or whatever it is and sending it to that person. So it was like to see that person in my mind's eye and be able to really like have my full intention on sending them love and healing and whatever. It just kind of, it gave me a new appreciation for what prayer is capable of. So like I said, I just cycled through everybody in my life, friends, family members, coworkers, I mean, you name it. And it was like just sending them loving, healing energy. So the last thing to come up at the end of night 2 was I started to think about a coworker who had just been getting on everybody's last nerve. And I realized that I needed to drop the anger that I had toward him. It kind of just showed me that even though he could be painfully annoying, that I realized again that he was the product of a rough upbringing, no father, that kind of deal. And he didn't know any better. Like, I think it was a matter of the annoying and power hungry and just aggressive person he had become was the product of not having a father growing up. So although we could all from a distance see that he had a broken way of interacting with other people, that was just normal to him and he didn't know any better. So the message that came through was that all of this wasn't truly affecting my quality of life and that I just needed to roll with the punches, not sweat the small stuff, and let it all go. And with that, the ceremony was called to an end. She told everybody sip water, start to ground. And again, I went back to the car, went to the tripping playlist, and watched the stars. So like the last weekend, night 2 was much heavier and produced much more healing than night 1 did. On neither of the 2 nights did I have any of the divorce stuff listed as an intention, yet I got the introduction on night 1 and completed the work on night 2 all around it. So although I do think it's important to have intentions set when you go into plant medicine ceremonies, you never know what you're going to encounter or what you're going to unpack, because that was not even on my radar, and both nights had a pretty decent devotion to that. So my divorce was actually finalized in November of 2016, and I quickly moved into an amazing relationship with my current girlfriend. Everything was and is absolutely perfect with the relationship, yet for the first few years, I couldn't seem to shake my ex-wife off of my mind. And like I'd said previously, I'd spent 10 years and essentially a third of my life with her, so it was understandable that I would think about her occasionally or that she would pop up in dreams, but after a few years, it just got old. I couldn't fathom why she would still pop up in my head a few days a week or still be the woman that popped up in my dreams while I was in a new relationship and everything else. But as soon as the ceremony was over and I did all that purging, it just magically stopped. And I kid you not, in the years that followed, maybe 1 or 2 dreams, but that was it. It was completely put to bed. Like, there was no more of this divorce-related trauma. So I thought back to my brother's wife had asked me shortly after the divorce if we were still friends, and without a pause, I replied, absolutely not. She seemed kind of taken back by the response, and understandably, how can you spend 10 years of your life so close to someone and then not even consider them a friend? But I, at the time, felt deserted, betrayed, angry, sad, all of the emotions. And the divorce was rather amicable, and there weren't really any hard feelings after, but we didn't talk for years other than short text interactions for financial matters. After this ayahuasca experience, I needed to reach out for some signatures to refinance the house. And this time I didn't feel any awkwardness reaching out to her. And it was actually nice to hear her voice and know that she was doing well. We actually ended up having a few hour-long conversations, just catching up on life, and it became very apparent that all of that bad blood was a thing of the past. It was such a relief. Her mom reached out to me after one of those conversations, and she said to me, I don't know what you and her talked about, but she is back to the same happy girl that she used to be. So clearly the healing that happened during that ceremony, and again, like I said, it's out there sending love and good vibes to everybody that came across my mind, her being one of them. So it was clearly that healing permeated just beyond myself, and I was glad to hear that. And I think this is a prime example of how the work starts when the ceremony ends. I purged the divorce trauma and the negative feelings toward the ex-wife, and I explained everything that I learned in that share circle the next morning. But the final part of the equation was actually reaching out to her and burying the hatchet. And that was what completed the healing. Honestly, throughout this podcast, it's been weird calling her my ex because that seems like a harsh term. But also, I don't want to use names to respect people's anonymity. But although we now live pretty far from each other and have both moved on to new relationships, I can say in confidence that I do still consider her a friend. So I think that's probably a good place to call it. Not a very long episode, but I think that this was a very powerful weekend in the fact that something that had, kept coming up in various plant medicine ceremonies, from psilocybin to the LSD to the cannabis assisted psychotherapy to the previous ayahuasca experience. It was, finally I had enough healing come through to put all of these negative feelings toward my ex-wife in the past and be able to move on and truly be able to embrace and enjoy the life that's ahead of me. So I know it's been a pretty long break between the last episode and this one. Still have a few people that I'm hoping to get on, but it's the holidays and might be a little more difficult to track people down. But that being said, I'll do my best to not have such a big break in between episodes going forward. Until next time, take care. Love y'all.